Welcome, Dr. Zan. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you.
I'm happy to talk to you today and learn a little bit more about the work that you do because you are trained in quite a few things and they all come together just so beautifully. But I'd love for you to start off with telling us how you got into this work.
Yeah. So like so many of us, this work is as much personal as it is professional. So I got into like the perinatal world actually when I was in grad school and I was working on my dissertation. I was reading a lot in the news about Black maternal mortality and just like the pretty abysmal rates in the United States.
Hmm.
And I wasn't even a mom yet at the time, but I knew that one day I wanted to be one. And reading all these news stories got me pretty fearful. I started to experience a lot of anxiety around it.
Yeah.
And so I just found myself up at night doing my own research on it, trying to figure out what it would be like for me to one day give birth in this country.
Mm.
And I started to realize that I was spending more time on that than doing my own like school and dissertation work.
Right.
And I decided, why not make this my project? Why not make this what I study and learn more about and research?
Hmm.
And so I ended up doing my dissertation on the impact of doula assisted care on Black people and Black experiences of birth. And that, I mean, that helped me personally, definitely. But it really, like going through those interviews with different moms, different Black people, just like really helped me see that there's so much more of a need
Mm.
on this like focus on people of color who give birth, right?
Right.
Just like the traumatic experiences that we tend to have.
Hmm.
I think like big T and little T trauma, like
Hmm.
the big T being, some of the more just like intense, more physical traumas that we experience. But the like other traumas that happen, like, being dismissed in the labor and delivery room, being
Hmm.
coerced, things like
Hmm.
that. Yeah, it got me like really interested in supporting and helping out moms like myself. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it kind of started off with this like kind of little personal journey, and then it kind of became my
Hmm.
whole profession.
Right. Um, so certainly, I mean, now that you've been in it for some time,
Mhm.
how much of that kind of initial concern, initial worry, the stuff that really brought you in, how much of that do you see in actuality, in like, you know, in the day
Yeah.
to day?
I see it pretty often.
Hmm.
I mean, I work with a wide range of folks who give birth, but a lot of people do seek me out who are people of color,
Hmm.
because there just aren't many of us in this specific field.
Yeah.
And specifically, the folks of color are pretty anxious and nervous about what it's like to give birth, what it might be like for them. There are still stories popping up all the time about people who have died or who've had, infant deaths, other sorts
Hmm.
of traumas that have happened.
Yeah.
And it's not because of their race, it's because of racism, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so I see it all the time. I experienced it myself when I was pregnant and preparing for my birth.
Okay, right. The thing you feared was like right there before you,
Exactly, exactly.
from like medical providers. Um,
Yeah, yeah. From everyone. I mean,
mhm,
I think that there's there are pros and cons to being in this field,
mhm,
and just like having the knowledge that we do. For me, when I was pregnant, I experienced a lot of anxiety just because I had seen the worst of the worst. I've,
right,
walked with people through the worst of the worst.
right.
And so that just made me really anxious and fearful about what my experience might be.
Yeah, I mean that it's um, the information and education and all of that is powerful, so that you
Hmm.
know what to look out for, what to potentially prepare for, how to navigate it. But I mean, how do you help people balance that, or at least deal with the knowledge of that and the truth
Hmm.
of it, and try to have the best birth possible given
Right.
those circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that knowledge is powerful, and I kind of like think about it as sort of like equipping and arming people
Mm,
with knowledge so that they can go into the experience being fully informed.
yeah.
And also, I think for me, like one way to combat all of the negativity, the oppression that we're seeing all the time
Yeah.
is to lean into experiences of joy, specifically like in our POC BIPOC communities.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, kind of a tangential sort of example is, anytime that we see or I see like Black deaths in the media that come up, like death by cops, things like that,
Mm-hmm.
we see it all over Instagram, right? And so like we feel really inundated with that, and it's important to see, but it's also important to see Black people thriving and
Yes.
Black people experiencing joy and
Right.
peace and happiness. And so that's something that I work with my clients on. Is like, yes, we're talking about some of like the scary things that might happen, but it's also important to talk about all the beautiful things that might happen, right? And like
Mm-hmm.
to find ways to find joy within your pregnancy experience and your birth experience. I remember for me, when I was pregnant, my doula helped sort of like walk me through that while I was feeling so anxious.
Mm-hmm.
Just like help me lean into what I found joyful about being pregnant and what I found to be exciting about expecting my baby. And that was like
Right.
a really helpful like counter to all the fear that I was experiencing.
Right. Sure. I mean, it would be I think relatively easy to be on the lookout, start to be vigilant,
Oh
like
yeah,
looking out for, not that you wouldn't already be vigilant, but I mean, being in a new experience and having a new
exactly.
type of vigilance. It takes an incredible amount of effort in any case to combat that and to shift focus and
Oh yeah,
attention somewhere else. It's mm, I don't know how else to say it. It's like another thing
it
you
is.
have to
Yeah.
do to try and cope.
Right. And I don't think it's possible to do without support.
Right.
Like I said, I had my doula, my clients have me and have other people in their lives, right? Like it's important to have community and people who can, I mean, you're never gonna unknow the things that
Mm-hmm.
you know, like some of the scary things, but like
Right.
just to help add something else to the narrative. Having community to sort of help you with that is really important.
Absolutely. What are some of the pressures? Like what might be some of the things that people are thinking through while
Mhm.
making decisions on how they want to birth and who they want to have around them and those
Mhm.
types of things?
Yeah, I think for people of color, especially, we're kind of held under a microscope, just like generally, like
Mm-hmm.
taking parenting and birth, putting that to the side,
Right.
we're often just like held under a microscope. And we feel that, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
anytime we're making decisions, we're thinking about what we want, but we're thinking also about how we might be perceived by other people,
Yeah.
how we might be judged. Little experiences that we have with people might escalate into them calling the cops on us, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we're thinking about that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so taxing, right?
Yeah.
Like you talked about hypervigilance. That's like
Yeah.
kind of there at our baseline
Mm-hmm.
all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so then adding parenting decisions and birthing decisions onto that,
Right.
I think that moms and parents in general are also held under a microscope. So there's this like double thing happening for parents
Right.
of color when we're making our parenting decisions. It's pretty
Right.
challenging.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I mean the amount of again, just like cognitive and emotional work that takes, and pressure,
Mm-hmm.
being under a microscope,
Yeah.
like you're describing, is a lot of additional stress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
What are the things that you do in your process, in your practice of helping people um, get connected to the experience that they really want to have or bring
Mm-hmm.
in things that they maybe hadn't thought about as an option?
Yeah, so there are a few different things that I do. I like to kind of go through almost like a guided meditation sort of experience with the pregnant people around what they imagine their births to be like,
Mm.
and what they imagine their postpartum experiences to be like. And I think that that is like a really important piece, actually. We focus so much on the birth experience,
Right.
and as long as births last, to me, they're just a moment, and postpartum is really forever, right?
Right.
And people kind of forget that piece. And
Hmm.
so, kind of walking folks through what they imagine their birth to be like and what they imagine their postpartum experience to be like. What I often see is that people have these elaborate birth plans and like ideas of what they want for their birth, and they haven't given much thought to what they want in postpartum. So, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of what I do is sort of like help them start to even just like take the step of imagining what their postpartum experience could be like, what
Right.
it would be like to actually be held and be supported by community. And like knowing that, yeah, you've got your baby, but like you also have other people around you who got you. Like, how do we make
Hmm.
that happen?
Hmm. And how do you or do you kind of incorporate all of the things that you do as a psychologist, as a birth educator, as a doula? Do all of those things kind of come together, or are they like separate offerings, I
Yeah.
guess?
Yeah. So they are separate offerings, but they are sort of interconnected,
Sure,
right?
because it's
And
you.
so,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. I bring them together.
Right, right.
Um, So usually they come together most when I'm working in sort of a therapeutic context.
Hmm.
I'm working with most of the time it is pregnant folks. Like some postpartum folks will come to me.
Hmm.
But when I'm working with pregnant folks, yeah, we're doing the therapy work, sure. But there's a lot of preparation for birth that's happening.
Hmm.
And that's where like some of my coaching skills come in, some of my like education, childbirth education, lactation education skills come in. I'm not there like as their childbirth educator, but if
Hmm.
they have questions, I have that knowledge where I can answer their questions or
Right.
direct them to certain resources. I am really, my hope is to be able to prepare them mentally for what's to come.
Hmm.
And that happens through therapy, but also through some of this education work as well.
Right. I mean, it seems like it would be useful for maybe all therapists to have
I
have
mean,
that
I
education.
agree. I mean, anybody who's in the perinatal world, I'm like, just do a doula training. Just do a doula training. It is
Hmm.
so, so helpful, whether or not you've given birth. Like, there's so much that you learn and you get to know and understand about your client's experience. I think it's so helpful. Even if you don't become a doula, right?
Right.
Like, you have the knowledge base.
Is a doula like if somebody wanted to do that, a doula training, is that just like a one-time class? Is it a several
Yeah.
weeks?
So usually they are like several weeks. Some are like maybe like a weekend long intensive or something
Hmm.
like that. But since the pandemic, they have ones that are online.
Oh, sure.
They have like online cohorts and things. The in-person ones are beautiful, but
Hmm.
like, we do what we can do. But I think that they are pretty accessible and they're open to people who, actually want to be practicing doulas or people who just like want the knowledge.
Right, right. So, some of the work that you do involves incorporating ancestral practices. Can you speak a
Mhm.
little bit more to that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Um, I found that for me, it was really important to sort of like incorporate my Congolese culture into my pregnancy experience and my birth experience. And I found it to be incredibly healing to me. And I started to wonder how it might be helpful to other people to also sort of like incorporate their own ancestral backgrounds and traditions into their experiences.
Hmm.
And what I found is that it has been incredibly healing for folks. Even people who aren't like that spiritual or even that like connected to their backgrounds,
Hmm.
like spending time doing a little bit of research or like talking to different family members about
Right,
what their birth experiences were like or what birth experiences were like historically in their cultures
right.
has been like a really beautiful experience for folks. And then they find ways to incorporate that into their own experiences also in a really, really beautiful way.
I imagine as you were talking about it, I just was imagining how much more kind of grounded somebody could feel, like connected
Mm-hmm.
to something kind of bigger than themselves,
Mm-hmm.
that has like deep and strong roots, um, that they can use to draw strength from, and that kind of
Absolutely.
thing. Is that what
Absolutely.
it feels like?
Yeah. I mean, we always talk about the village, right? Like it
Hmm.
takes a village to give birth, to be pregnant, to raise a child.
Hmm.
And we kind of forget that the village can also include those who came before us. right? And so
Beautiful.
like
Yeah.
really including them into our process also. Even again, if you're not like that spiritual of a person, it's not like you have to talk to your ancestors or anything, but
Right.
like how do you sort of like still incorporate them and their practices in what you're doing now? It's really
Hmm.
supportive.
Hmm. What are some of the things that have been coming up for you or people that you meet with a lot, in terms of how they're presenting or how they're feeling and what you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that has been coming up a lot for a lot of people right now has been like this concept of mom rage. You know,
Hmm.
we hear a lot about postpartum depression and anxiety and even like PTSD,
Right.
but something that's like really been like brought to light more has been the rage that a lot of moms experience, you know, because of being overstimulated,
Hmm.
overwhelmed,
Hmm.
underslept, like all the
Right.
things and just like not having support. And I think that a lot of the messaging around mom rage is that like it's it's okay to feel and like sort of like let yourself feel it in healthy ways, right? And
Mm.
help regulate yourself, that kind of a thing, which I think is all wonderful and great. But I think that what the conversation is missing is the conversation around what rage looks like in BIPOC communities,
Mm.
especially with Black people, I'll say,
Yeah.
because we Black women are oftentimes already labeled the angry Black woman,
Right.
even if
Mm.
we're just being assertive or
Right.
just sort of like reacting in a way that any other person would react to a situation.
Hmm.
And so it's again that like scrutiny on the Black experience. And yeah, we see that when it comes to mom rage, it's like not as safe for Black moms or moms of color to just experience their rage
Hmm.
because then they're going to get this label or there's this fear of maybe CPS taking their kids away, which happens all the time
Right.
for folks of color. Fear of the police getting called, like I said before.
Right.
It just like there are these extra considerations that we have to take because of the ways that we're already being viewed by society.
Right. So, uh, what is how might somebody cope with that who's hearing the, yeah, go ahead and express yourself, but knows that, oh, I can't actually really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you help them cope with that?
I think finding safe spaces is really important, whether that's with a therapist of color, or like with other friends or community members who you feel like you can actually let it out with and like just
Hmm.
be your true messy self
Hmm.
without having to button up for society. That's like really, really important. I mean, so much of what I say, what I teach is that like community heals so much, right?
Hmm.
And this is like another instance of that. Like if you're able to find a safe community where you can really just be yourself, it's
Right.
just like this safe haven in this world where you really can't walk around as yourself.
Ugh. It's just there's so many layers of stress, different types of stress, different ways
Mm-hmm.
that, like, you almost have to like walk on a tightrope just to,
Mm-hmm.
make it through certain situations. And
Absolutely.
I mean, and that stress has real impacts, right?
It does. Yeah. Like the concept of weathering,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the stress that we experience over a lifetime of oppression is like compounded. And we
Right.
see so many like illnesses come up that maybe wouldn't have come up for 7, 8 years, that are coming
Mm-hmm.
up in younger and younger generations of people because of the impact of weathering, the impact of oppression on the body, like on a cellular level.
Is there an understanding of why it's happening to younger and younger people?
Um, it's I wouldn't say necessarily that it's like happening to younger and younger people. I guess the way that I would phrase it is that um, certain illnesses that for other races or other demographics that would happen later on in life
Oh, okay.
happen earlier for Black people
I see
because of
what
the
you're saying.
impact of weathering.
Okay, right. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, so I mean, I know there in some ways there's some of the stresses are just kind of like the water you're in, the weather you're in, and if
Hmm.
you've been in it for so long, it doesn't necessarily register as like, oh, that experience was based in systemic racism. It
Right.
it just is, a pain.
Hmm.
or something that is registered physiologically or emotionally. But, none of us really are walking around being able to fully label every single thing
Right, right.
that's impacting us. So that like the cumulative effect um, is can be really physiologically, emotionally, mentally um, overwhelming and quite devastating.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, like my hope for my clients isn't to every single time they experience something be able to name it and feel it. That's a lot on the body, right? Like
Yeah,
I think that
yeah.
there is like a healthy level of like distance from
Mm.
some of what we're experiencing because that's how we survive it, right?
Yes,
It's tough. It's tough, but it is how we survive it.
right. Um, and going back to the research that you did
Mhm.
for your dissertation and what you've seen since, what
Yeah.
are you noticing is the benefit and impact of having a doula for BIPOC folks?
Yeah. And I, before I even answer that question, I kind of want to make sure that folks know like the difference between like a doula and a midwife and what a
Ah,
doula
sure.
actually is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because I find so many people, use them interchangeably or think
Hmm.
that a doula is like this more like sort of hippie kind of a concept.
Right.
But more and more people are using doulas and are relying on them, whether or
Yep.
not they have home births or hospital births or birth center births. And a doula really is your companion and your advocate throughout your birth experience. A midwife is a medical professional who's like more akin to an OB-GYN,
Hmm.
but a doula isn't a medical professional. A doula is like your partner in this experience,
Hmm.
who helps to prepare you for birth and helps take care of you afterwards. And also helps if you have a partner or family members around, kind of like helps prepare them and advocate for
Hmm.
them also.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, doulas are really magical in that way,
Hmm.
and especially for people of color. I did my dissertation research on this sort of experience. And what I found was that while doulas aren't able to necessarily prevent the experiences of racism or trauma or oppression that happen throughout the perinatal period, they contribute tremendously to the healing that happens afterwards through, validation and connection and like sort of like helping you become more resourced when you're in birth, like a lot of your resources just are depleted
Right.
and they sort of help build those resources, both internal and external resources up
Hmm.
again for you. And a lot of healing can happen for folks because they have that advocate, they have that support.
Is there, which is again going back to the research, the impact do you see and did you see and do you see more positive birth outcomes just for the kind of mental health
Mm-hmm.
a part of the journey?
Yeah. And I mean, yes, for the mental health. And I want to say that for the physical health too, there are
Mm-hmm.
studies out there that show that there are less C-section rates and less premature
Mm-hmm.
births that come from having this like advocate for you who can help you say no to these unneeded and unnecessary interventions, right?
Right.
And so I think that that does help mentally too. People
For
feel
sure.
so much more safe and secure knowing that they have someone,
Yeah.
you know, you might have like the greatest birth plan. You might be a really direct and assertive person, but when you're in the throes of labor, you are kind
Mm-hmm.
of a different person entirely.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're not even there.
Right.
And it's so nice to have someone who knows exactly what you want and can like help advocate when you're not able to.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, there's that potential sense of safety and empowerment, being able to lean on somebody else's knowledge
Mm-hmm.
and expertise. Uh, I mean, that's a really big deal.
It
And I
is.
know there are mm, more and more doulas out
Mm-hmm.
there. Like you said before, it is becoming more and more well known that's an option, and even a lot
Mm-hmm.
of programs out there that are starting to use even systemic, like hospital programs that are
Yeah.
starting to use um, doulas, or at least be more okay with letting doulas in.
Yeah.
Are,
Yeah.
are you seeing that expand?
I definitely am seeing that expand. There are so many hospitals that are, like you said, sort of like allowing that to be present more,
Hmm.
allowing doulas to come in more, which I think is so necessary.
Yeah.
Um, I think that maybe more education around what doulas can do and what they are could be helpful, even in those systems.
Yeah.
'Cause what I hear a lot is like, why do I need a doula if I have my partner, or if I have my mom
Right.
there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And your partner and your mom, your family members are also experiencing something along with you. They are
Hmm.
also in it,
Hmm.
especially if you experience any sort of birth trauma. They're also being traumatized in the experience. It's
Right.
so helpful to have someone who can support the whole unit,
Yes.
who's like not directly involved, who's not in the unit themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to what you were saying before is, a partner or a mother or family member might not have the knowledge of
Hmm.
birth or options, um,
Right.
or options that are available to them that potentially the hospital isn't outlining for them
Yeah,
either.
absolutely. Yeah. And many doulas have worked in the different hospital settings that you're in, or the birth center settings that
Mm-hmm.
you're in.
Mm-hmm.
And so they kind of like know how to navigate the system a bit more. They can help
Yeah.
you on that level as well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm having memories of my own process. I had a doula, same doula for both births of
Hmm.
my kids, and just how incredibly important it was that she was there. Um,
Yeah. How great that you had that sort of continuity too between the two births.
yeah, yeah, yeah. They were like 3 years apart, so thankfully she was, still around.
Hmm. Yeah.
um, um, but the thing, especially for the first one, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what
Yeah.
was an option for me, and there was a time where I was like out of my mind. I was in labor for a long time,
Uh-huh.
and she like gave my husband a break and just
Hmm.
just kind of managed stuff.
Yeah.
And anyways, there's so many ways in which it was helpful, but even in the process of looking for a doula and interviewing folks, I had to ask them, like, oh, have you worked in the hospital that I'll be giving birth?
Right.
And like, what are your experience with those doctors? And some of them were like, oh, steer clear of X, Y, or Z
Hmm.
OB, because they know, they have
Yeah.
this like insider knowledge, which was really cool.
Yeah, like how healing is that? Just to
Hmm.
feel that safety, right? To
Hmm.
feel held even before hiring them on as a doula.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's really really powerful for
Hmm.
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, pausing.
Hmm.
Oh, anything else about the research that you did or what you've seen since then?
Um, I don't think so.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
just checking.
Hmm.
Um, okay, okay. So after somebody has gone through their birth, whether whatever their experience was,
Hmm.
how do you support people to kind of process or reflect on that?
Yeah, in a few different ways. I mean, what even if you had a wonderful birth experience that like where there was no birth trauma, right? And you even don't have any sort of like postpartum depression or anxiety, the transition into becoming a new mom or a new
Hmm.
parent is really intense, right? Like we know
Yeah,
this. It's
yeah, yeah.
very intense. And it's kind of an experience where you don't really know until you know, until
Hmm.
you've gone
Hmm.
through it
Hmm.
before.
For sure.
And so I sort of support and help people through that transition. There's just like a lot of who am I now? Who is this baby? I'm supposed to connect with this baby, but I can't even connect with myself. I don't know who I am anymore.
Yeah,
Right? These are
yeah.
very real, very common experiences where people can use a little bit of support and like
Right.
just like the validation of knowing that
Hmm.
yes, this is common. Of course, like you'll get there again, like you'll get to know yourself, maybe your new self again. But right now, this is really hard. Like, of course, you're if having a hard time connecting with your baby. You're having a
Yeah.
hard time connecting with who you are now. Like,
Right.
let's give yourself some grace and some patience through this and self compassion. Like, I help walk people through that pretty stark transition.
Do you find that people want to talk about it? Like that they, um, mm, that it's, well, yeah, that they want to be able to talk through like what just happened, um, to either try and um, understand parts of what their experience um, were, or to, I don't know, to just try and hold a memory of it,
Hmm.
because so many
Yeah.
things happen.
So many things happened. I mean, I feel like immediately after birth, not a lot of people are ready yet to talk
Mm-hmm,
about their actual birth experience.
mm-hmm,
A lot of people are just in the throes of new motherhood, getting connected with this baby. And it's not even like a want to talk about that, but
mm-hmm.
like almost a desperation. Like,
Oh,
I
yeah,
need to figure out what's happening to me right now. And I
yeah,
need
yeah,
to figure out if this is normal and okay. Like, that is a
yeah,
lot of what I see in like
yeah.
the immediate postpartum. And then like a little bit down the line, folks start to realize that there are like aspects of their birth that they want to talk about. They want to
Mm-hmm,
understand better, that
mm-hmm,
sort of like connect to how they're feeling now. Right. And so it does take a little while for folks to be ready, I feel like, to talk about their birthing
mm-hmm,
experiences.
mm-hmm.
Again, even if their births went exactly how they planned it to be,
Right.
it's a pretty intense experience. And
Mm-hmm,
so, yeah, people sometimes need a bit of time, especially if there was trauma. If there was trauma, there's like a lot more time, a lot more space involved in going, tiptoeing into the birth story if they feel comfortable doing so.
yeah.
And that involves like a lot more like trauma, like therapeutic trauma work to get through.
Right, for sure. For sure. Yeah, there can be like a long, could potentially be a while before somebody's like, wait a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah,
and starting to remember
absolutely.
those, that wasn't right, or,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. To
And
exit,
sometimes
yeah.
I was gonna say that sometimes it doesn't even happen until a subsequent birth or a subsequent
Mm-hmm,
pregnancy, and they start
mm-hmm,
to realize, oh, wait, there were things about this previous pregnancy that are
mm-hmm,
still sitting with me, that are still in my body that I
mm-hmm,
hadn't yet processed. Like,
mm-hmm,
let's talk about it now.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's really powerful. It can be really powerful to walk through that story and kind of figure out what happened, put things like, arrange them,
Mm-hmm.
how you need to. Um, is there any particular way that you found is not most beneficial, but like the idea of talking through your story,
Mm-hmm.
with
Yeah.
with a professional is
Mm-hmm.
can be really healing. But are there other ways that people tell their story that's also empowering?
Yeah, I think that it's helpful to talk to the other folks that were in the space.
Mm,
So a lot of times when I'm working with folks on their birth story, if they specifically want to talk through their birth story, maybe they want to be able to write it out, but it's a little bit traumatic and they need help with that. It might be helpful to also talk with their partner or their
mm,
doula, like other people that were in the space. Yes, to like help fill the gaps, because again, sometimes the birthing people like aren't actually like really present and
right.
in the experience. um but also to do like a bit of reality checking.
Mm,
Like, there are times when someone who has given birth has maybe like a different memory of the experience that um is actually like a memory that could be like harmful to them, right? That like
mm-hmm,
maybe holds themselves with not a lot of compassion, whereas like their doula or their partner can look at them and say, "No, wait, you actually did that." Like, right? Like, I
mm-hmm,
watched you do that thing that maybe you forgot, or like maybe you didn't realize that you
right,
actually made this step or took this action, but you
right,
did this.
right.
And it's like it's easy to forget. It's easy to be sort of like overcome with all of the other emotions that are present. And to
Mm-hmm,
have someone sort of like remind you of who you are and what you
mm-hmm.
did can be
Yeah,
such a powerful experience.
yeah, for sure. I love that. Yeah, it is. So, I mean, you could be have gone very internal,
Oh yeah,
in the process. You're not
I
like
know I did.
clocking everything, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, um, yeah, for sure. I'm going back to some of my own memories now. Yep.
Yep.
I was not aware of a lot of stuff going on outside of me, but
Yeah.
yeah. What do you? What do you think, or how do you feel about listening to other people's birth stories, whether they were positive or there were difficulties in the birth stories that you might be listening to?
Hmm. Like, how do I personally feel about it?
Yeah, like in terms of as either a support or a way for like somebody who's been through something difficult for them to listen to another person's birth story that might be
Hmm.
similar or have
Yeah.
some other aspects to it that are not similar.
Yeah, I think that it's tricky and it can be beautiful, right? Like there
Mm-hmm.
are ways that it can feel really validating to know
Mm-hmm.
that you're not the only one who's gone through this.
Mm-hmm.
I think that folks that have had particularly traumatic experiences can really feel like they're the only ones that experience this thing. And that can feel really isolating. The
Mm-hmm.
isolation can lead to experiences of depression, right? Like
Right.
it can be sort of a domino effect. So having safe community where you feel like, oh wait, I'm not the only person who's gone through this. This is
Mm-hmm.
actually experience that other people have had, and I have someone who I can like talk to, who I can
Mm-hmm.
relate to.
Mm-hmm.
That can be a really beautiful thing. And there are ways that like comparison can happen, and
Oh,
that can be damaging also, right? Like if someone had a somewhat similar experience, but maybe and it was better in one way, or had an aspect of their birth that you
mm-hmm.
wish that you could have had,
Yeah.
that could be hard. And so it
Right.
really there is a balance there. Like I think that something that we all as parents fall prey to is comparison.
Yeah.
It just happens. I'm like finding myself thinking of like the famous Bluey episode about the baby race where like the moms are comparing themselves to each other. Like it is such a common experience. And it can be so damaging to us. And so just like being aware and mindful of that, like
Mm-hmm.
really taking in that validation and that support and
Mm-hmm.
like really trying to combat the like urge to compare yourself and your experience to someone else's.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it could be a real slippery slope
Absolutely.
to just feeling bad about yourself. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is hard. Like that tension between it being supportive and potentially making you feel bad about yourself is really there. And I
Yeah,
mean,
absolutely.
you could for sure feel that just walking down the street, like seeing somebody
Yeah.
else, and not
Tell
even
me about
knowing
it.
somebody's story.
Yeah, absolutely. I do feel like, even though there is the risk of that comparison,
Hmm.
the sort of overwhelming majority of experiences of like being in mom groups or postpartum support groups are beneficial. Right? They
Yeah.
are actually like helpful and healing and supportive.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, yeah, I mean, there are definitely support groups out there and even birth story type workshop sort
Hmm.
of things. And more, anyways, I'm seeing that there are specific color groups for women of color,
Hmm.
specific groups for Black mothers, specific groups for BIPOC birthing folks.
Hmm.
Are you seeing more and more of that available, and are you hearing from people about the importance of that?
Yeah, I mean, I am definitely hearing from people the importance of that. I'm seeing them like sort of like trickle in more and more, but it feels like not at the pace that folks are wanting, right?
Uh-huh.
Like there is such a high demand
Mm-hmm.
and there's still not enough. I mean, I have worked in programs where it's like specifically for Black folks or specifically for people of color. And those experiences, folks say like it's the safest that they've ever felt.
Mm-hmm.
They're in places with people who are like them or who've
Mm-hmm.
had similar experiences. Even like if they've had different life backgrounds, they still have the similar experience of being Black in America or being a person of
Mm-hmm.
color in America
Mm-hmm.
and experiencing all that comes with that, experiencing what that's like in a hospital setting or a medicalized setting, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so feeling that sameness feels really safe to people and they feel like they are comfortable and are able to actually share their experience without feeling maybe judged or feeling like they're not understood by the person next to them, right? And so those experiences are really, really impactful. Even like for me, as someone who was like facilitating some of those groups,
Mm-hmm.
it even felt healing for me, to
Yeah.
be in sort of like similar kind of a space with someone. Um, yeah, I really wish that more of them were available across the country.
Yeah.
I think different states have, different amounts of them. I'm in California where there are just like a lot more,
Yeah.
but there are
Yeah.
states where there's like really
Yeah.
are none, right? Yeah, I think that, some of these programs and these groups are trickling in more and more, and like different states have different amounts of them. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm in California where there are many groups that are, you know, designed for different demographics, but there are other states where these kinds of programs and these kinds of groups are really few and far between, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I really, really hope that the future involves more spaces for people of color in general, but specifically moms of color.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess call to action.
Right, exactly.
Whoever's available, bring it on. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that this has been like a really, I mean, beautiful and rich conversation, but it's also kind of heavy,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
we have been talking about some like pretty traumatic stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
That impacts a lot of people of color. And I kind of want to go back to what I had said earlier. Like, we can't unknow some of this stuff, we can't unexperience it.
Right.
It's our lives all the time. And I really want to urge folks of color, especially ones who are giving birth, who are about to give birth, who have
Mm-hmm.
given birth,
Mm-hmm.
to like try to lean into joy as well, right? We can't ignore the reality of our existence, but we can also find these moments of like peace and joy and safety where we can. That involves a lot of community care. So maybe that's a call to action to everybody else who's like in community with folks of color. Like, be there and show up for them, be those
Mm-hmm.
safe spaces for us because we really, really need it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I think um, sometimes I lose a little bit of perspective, like being in a specialty where a lot of difficult things are discussed,
Yeah.
and that's for maybe for you too, that we hear of really difficult things all the time, and
Hmm.
not everybody hears those things all the time. So I really appreciate you bringing that in.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you. And all of the work that you're doing and sharing everything with us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Happy to.